Hi folks, how are you? Welcome to Complexity Unraveled. If this is the first time on this channel, we cover a wide range of topics from technology, megatrends, business venture, to macroeconomic and social issues. To put it differently, we're interested in topics that are complex in nature and of great relevance to the society. On this channel, no one will ask you to like, share, or subscribe, so please click on nothing, smash nothing, and buy nothing. If you share our interest in this kind of topics, please give us 15 minutes of your attention and we promise to make it worthwhile. We never intended to run an ESG channel, and we will definitely not turn this channel into one. It just so happened that somehow, lately in our professional capacity, we were dealing with tons of topics that are closely related to business opportunities in the space of ESG. We have done two videos previously, one on the progress of renewable energy deployment and the other one on the prospect of global carbon peak. Together, these two videos serve as kind of a preparation for our today's topic. Please check them if you are interested. It will make the arguments in this video much more comprehensive. Just in case, here is the TLDR version of them. After decades-long effort, solar and wind make up for only 3% of our final energy consumption. With roughly 20% degree of electrification, our current society undoubtedly runs on fossil fuel. All the ambitious climate endeavors, whether net zero or 2-degree target, they are all built upon a simple assumption. The global carbon emission will soon peak, and then undergo a drastic and rapid decline. Based on all the evidences, it's extremely unlikely that the global carbon peak will occur in the near future. All the findings lead us to our today's topic, the negative emission technology. A topic that has always been around, but somehow never really enjoyed much attention. From our perspective, a fatal mistake. Despite the common perception, renewable energy doesn't really address the core issue. Negative emission technology, on the other side, has the potential to literally reverse the climate change. First thing first, what is actually the core issue here? Within the scientific community, there is a broad consensus that there is a linear correlation between the global warming and the accumulated amount of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, more than 2,000 gigatons of CO2 has been released into the Earth's atmosphere. And this excessive amount of CO2 is the real reason behind global warming. With almost 40 gigatons annual carbon emissions, there is no doubt that the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is still constantly rising. But here's the thing. The energy transition and the push for renewable energy only reduce the carbon emission from this point onwards. Of course, it makes the problem grow slower, but it doesn't change the fact that the problem is still constantly growing. Even if we can pull off the net zero, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is still there, and the nature will not be able to reduce it fast enough by itself. Look, we need renewable energy to make a sustainable future possible. We are not here to argue against that. The point we want to make across is, without negative emission technology, there might be no future at all. And some people might argue, if that is the case, if negative emission technology is so indispensable, how comes that there is almost no presence of this topic in today's climate policy? We certainly don't want to get into the discussion on populistic politics and the risk of ideology-driven policy, so let's just say there is a fundamental disconnection between policymaking and scientific evidence. As early as in 2013, the Intergovernmental Panel IPCC concluded that we will need the negative emission technology to overcome humanity's greatest challenge. Their estimation indicates up to 1,000 gigatons of CO2 would need to be removed by the end of this century. That would be 25 years worth of carbon emissions based on our current emission level, a mind-blowing 1 trillion tons of CO2. The national academies reached the same conclusion and estimate that we will need to remove 10 gigatons of CO2 annually by the mid of this century, and up to 20 gigatons every year towards the end of this century. And this emerging market will ultimately reach a size that is 3 to 5 times of today's petroleum industry. Well, take a guess. How much CO2 can we remove every year? If you do some digging, you probably will come across the number 40 million tons a year. That is really a fraction of our current carbon emissions, just 0.1%. But if you think this number is shockingly low, it will get worse. The overwhelming majority of these 40 million tons cannot really be considered negative emission technology. Most of these carbon capturing devices are installed at the point of emission, as an integral part of coal-fired power plant, gas processing facility, chemical plants, etc. Their purpose is to capture the CO2 emitting from the processes, preventing more CO2 being released into the atmosphere. This kind of technology is what we call conventional carbon capture. We don't want to get sidetracked again, but there are three different categories for conventional carbon capture: post-combustion, pre-combustion, and oxy-fuel. Regardless of what type of technology is applied, it's ultimately an emission reduction, not negative emission. Emission reduction reduces the emission that would be otherwise released into the atmosphere. Negative emission, on the other side, addresses the existing amount of CO2 and literally sucks CO2 out of the atmosphere and leads to a net negative emission. We already have that technology in our arsenal, the so-called direct air capture, a technology that captures CO2 in the ambient air. Do you remember the 40 million tons capturing capacity we mentioned earlier? If we look at the negative emission technology, the capturing capacity of direct air capture, among the 40 million tons capturing capacity, only 8,000 tons is direct air capture. 8,000 tons among 40 million tons, a laughable 0.02% of the entire existing capacity. To put it into context, we might need to remove up to 1 trillion tons of CO2. And right now, the best we can do is 8,000 tons a year. And by the way, if we have done this topic a year ago, the number would be 4,000 tons. A pilot plant with 4,000 tons annual capturing capacity went into operation last year and effectively doubled the global capacity. If you are into emerging technologies or new business ventures, I'm quite sure you have seen tons of ideas with phenomenal growth potential in the past. But to be frank, a mismatch between demand and supply at this magnitude just redefined the term growth potential for us. You see, IEA estimates by 2030, we would need 85 million tons direct air capturing capacity. By 2050, the required capacity would increase to roughly 2 gigatons a year. That's 2 billion tons a year. Compared with today's 8,000 tons capacity, it represents a 10,000x growth within this decade, and another 25x growth from 2030 to 2050. And this might surprise you. The estimation from International Energy Agency is literally the lower end of the range. In the IPCC Sustainable Development Scenario, the estimation ranges from 3.5 gigatons to as high as 16 gigatons a year, which would represent a mind-boggling 2 million x within the next 3 decades, a whopping 168% compound annual growth rate for 28 years straight. If 10 to 20 gigatons of CO2 needs to be removed every year, with an average carbon price at $50 to $100 per ton, the market size could easily reach $500 billion to $2 trillion a year. And today, the market for direct air capture is essentially non-existent. With all that being said, the absolute necessity, insane market potential, trillion-dollar market, and yet without big fuss. So what is the catch? Well, cost. You see, in the case of carbon capture, the cost and complexity grow dramatically with decreasing CO2 concentration. As for conventional carbon capture, since they are primarily installed at the point of emission, the CO2 concentration in the flue gas is way higher than in the ambient air. For instance, in the coal-fired power plant, the CO2 concentration is roughly 14%, 22% in cement production, and almost 99% in ammonia production. On the contrary, in the ambient air, the CO2 concentration is merely 0.04%, or the 400 ppm people often refer to. Since direct air capture is designed to work with ambient air, it requires more energy, and leads to much higher capturing cost. In the case of coal-fired power plant or in the steel industry using conventional carbon capture, the capturing cost is well below $100 per captured ton of CO2. In the case of direct air capture, the estimation goes as high as $650. Although the current direct air capture technologies are still quite early in their life cycle, there should be plenty of room for significant cost reduction in the future. Even though we won't have the time to dive too deep into the technical details of direct air capture, we still want to briefly touch up on the technology. For direct air capture, there are three main technology categories: solid direct air capture, liquid direct air capture, and electro-swing. Both solid and liquid direct air capture have already reached technology readiness level 6, with full-scale pilot plant currently in operation. Solid direct air capture is based on solid adsorbent going through adsorption and desorption cycle. While the adsorption takes place at room temperature and normal atmospheric pressure, the desorption happens through a temperature vacuum swing, which requires low pressure and medium temperature. In the first step, ambient air is drawn into a collector and captured on the surface of a highly selective arming-based filter material. Upon reaching saturation, the collector is closed and heated between 80 to 100 degrees to release the carbon dioxide and regenerate the solid adsorbent. Liquid direct air capture is adapted from existing industrial applications and based on two closed chemical loops. In the first loop, ambient air is brought into a contact unit, which is filled with hydroxide-based liquid solution. Upon contact, the solution chemically binds with CO2 molecule and traps CO2 in the form of carbonate salt. The carbonate salt is separated out from the solution into small pellets in a pellet reactor, which is adapted from water treatment technology. These pellets are then heated up to 900 degrees in a calciner in order to release the CO2 in pure gaseous form. And once again, the calciner is similar to equipment that is widely used in the mining industry for ore processing. Finally, the processed pellets are hydrated once again in a slaker and recycled back into the system. What really caught our eye is something called electro-swing adsorption. It's essentially a battery cell, an electrochemical battery cell where a solid electrode coated with carbon nanotube working as adsorbent. It adsorbs CO2 when negatively charged. Basically, the capturing takes place during charging, and the process is reversed during discharging. Instead of pressure or temperature, the capturing and releasing cycle is triggered by electric charge. Since heating represents the largest energy consumption in both liquid and solid direct air capture, electro-swing direct air capture has the potential to greatly reduce the energy consumption and leads to significant cost reduction. Not to mention, the capturing device itself being a battery is extremely advantageous in this context. Powering direct air capture with renewable energy is probably the most meaningful way to go. And the Achilles heel of renewable, especially solar and wind, is without a single shred of doubt the intermittency. A direct air capturing device that could be used as energy storage for renewable energy and capture CO2 in the process is truly something that makes us excited. On the other side though, no matter how fascinating the technology is, we still need sound business model to make it commercially viable. Let's talk about the global carbon market. In 2021, the global carbon credit market crossed $1 billion for the very first time. By 2030, this market is estimated to reach $50 billion. Although it probably makes less sense to talk about the global carbon market, it's actually quite regionalized. If you live in California, the LCFS credit was traded at over $200 at its height. In the European Union, the price of carbon emission allowance has increased from less than €10 to more than €90 in only 4 years. Even though carbon price in the aforementioned regions would make carbon credit trading a legit business model, there is probably more to come. You see, there is an immense price gap between the voluntary carbon credit and the carbon taxation. The global average price for carbon taxation is only 2-3 euro a ton. For instance, in Ukraine, the carbon tax is only €0.25 per ton. In Poland, it's even lower, just 7 cents per ton. In China and India, there is no explicit carbon taxation at all. Even though policymaking is not something we can influence, I think nobody would argue that over time, the price for carbon taxation and credit will increase. If we can manage to bring down the cost of direct air capture to a competitive level, it's only a question of time that a technically scalable and commercially viable business model will emerge. There is even more upside potential beyond carbon taxation and credit. Carbon storage and utilization is something that we are super excited about. Since it's not exclusively applicable for direct air capture, we will cover that in a separate video. But consider this as a teaser. Even though carbon storage doesn't really create value per se, but we can certainly put a price tag on the damage prevention. For instance, on the global level, the climate change could cost up to $23 trillion by 2050. By 2070, the cumulated cost could go well beyond $100 trillion, not to mention the millions and billions of human life involved. As for carbon utilization, enhanced oil recovery is the predominant application today, but there are exciting applications on the horizon. For instance, using carbon dioxide to synthesize starch, one of our primary sources for carbohydrate. The reusable rocket from SpaceX has once again put a decade-old idea into the spotlight, propelling a rocket using methane, which can be synthesized with carbon dioxide and hydrogen, or used as feedstock to produce calcium carbonate, a primary component in concrete and cement which are used in construction and building all over the world. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. Let's save it for another time. You know, over the years, we have looked into many topics that are related to climate change and sustainability. It's a rare occasion that we have a sense of optimism afterwards. This time it feels different. Industrialization has brought the human society forward. Unfortunately, also with some unintended consequences. With direct air capture, we might be able to put the genie back into the bottle. Sucking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and putting them back where they came from. I know it sounds primitive, but sometimes the simplest approach might be the most effective one. With scientists and engineers working on the direct air capture technology, we are cautiously optimistic that the price of direct air capture could drop significantly in the future, and we will find a way for massive deployment. It's not only about finding the next business with trillion-dollar market, it's also about finding a truly sustainable solution for climate change, a solution that is mathematically sound in theory and technologically feasible in practice. Until then, thank you for tuning in. Take care.